Somewhere in central Italy, if you could stand on a hillside on a quiet night and look out over the dark valleys below, you might feel like you're seeing something older than history. Older than the Forum, older than the legions, older than the name Rome itself. The olive trees don't care about empires. The rivers keep finding their way to the sea, and underneath the soil, if you knew where to look, you would find rooms full of painted walls, jars of perfumed oil, golden jewellery, and the bones of people who built something extraordinary and were almost completely forgotten. That's the thing about Italy before Rome. It wasn't empty. It wasn't waiting. It was already alive with a civilization so sophisticated, so strange, so genuinely powerful that the Romans themselves couldn't quite decide whether to admire it or pretend it never happened. And somehow, they almost got away with that second option. If you're using this to drift off tonight, that's exactly what it's here for. So settle in, get comfortable, and before you do, drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is. It's one of my favourite things. Someone in Tokyo at 6 a.m, someone in Toronto at midnight, someone in Edinburgh in the middle of a rainstorm. All of you finding the same quiet at different hours. I love that. Now, back to the hill. Before there were senators in togas debating in marble halls, before the Latin language spread across an entire empire, before anyone outside of the Italian peninsula had ever heard the word Rome, there was another civilization living in these hills and valleys. They built cities, they dug harbours, they traded with Greece and Carthage and the Eastern Mediterranean. They had a writing system, a complex religion, a rich tradition of art that could stop you cold if you walked into a museum and really looked at it. They had kings, and according to some ancient sources, those kings once ruled Rome itself. They were called the Etruscans, and then, gradually, they weren't anything at all. Their language stopped being spoken. Their cities were absorbed or abandoned. Their names were swallowed by Roman ones. The story of how that happened, and how much of it was deliberate erasure versus simple historical drift, is one of the most quietly haunting puzzles in all of ancient history. The clues we have are strange and scattered. Tombs mostly, dug into the volcanic rock, painted with banquets and dancers and sea creatures, as if the people inside were just resting rather than gone. Inscriptions in an alphabet we can read, but a language we still only partially understand. A few temple foundations. Some later Roman writers who mentioned them almost reluctantly, like a family mentioning a difficult relative. That's what we're going to follow tonight, those clues, that quiet trail of evidence through one of history's most fascinating disappearing acts. But before we can talk about the Etruscans disappearing, we need to understand what Italy actually looked like before anyone had erased anything. And the picture is messier and more interesting than most people realise. Forget the clean map you might have in your head. The one with Rome at the centre, and everything else arranged neatly around it. That map comes later, imposed by conquest and administration, and a very deliberate rewriting of who mattered. The Italy that existed in the centuries before Roman dominance was something else entirely. A patchwork, a mosaic of peoples, languages, traditions, and local identities, each shaped by the particular piece of landscape they happened to inhabit. And Italy's geography more or less guaranteed this. Think about what the peninsula actually looks like. The Apennine Mountains run like a spine down almost the entire length of the country, dividing east from west, creating valleys that face different directions, catch different weather, drain into different rivers. The coast in the west opens onto the Tyrrhenian Sea, warm and navigable, connected to the wider Mediterranean. The east faces the Adriatic, narrower, different currents, different trade partners. In the north, the Po Valley is a world unto itself, flat and fertile in a way that the rest of the peninsula simply isn't. In the south, the landscape fragments again into rugged hills and isolated coastal plains. What geography does when it divides a landscape like this is create pockets, separate communities developing separately, different languages emerging, different gods, different burial customs, different ways of building a house or crowning a king. By the Iron Age, maybe around 900 BCE, the Italian peninsula was home to dozens of distinct cultural groups, each with their own identity, and none of them particularly interested in deferring to anyone else. There were the Latins in the region around the Tiber, farming communities that would eventually produce Rome, though at this point they were just one group among many. The Umbrians lived further inland in the uplands of central Italy. The Samnites controlled the rugged Apennine territory to the south, fierce and independent in ways that would give Rome serious trouble for centuries. The Veneti occupied the northeastern corner of the peninsula, culturally distinct and maintaining their own trade connections into Central Europe, and along the southern coasts and in Sicily, Greek settlers had established colonies that were in some ways more sophisticated than anything else in Italy at the time. Cities like Cumae and Syracuse and Sybaris that were essentially extensions of the eastern Mediterranean world transplanted to Italian soil. And sitting in the middle of all this, in the region we now call Tuscany, and stretching into parts of Umbria and Campania, were the Etruscans. Not isolated from these neighbours, but deeply entangled with them, trading with the Greeks, influencing the Latins, competing with the Samnites, and connected through sea routes and merchant relationships to Carthage in North Africa, to Phoenician traders, to the whole restless commercial world of the ancient Mediterranean. That's something worth pausing on. Italy was plugged into long-distance trade networks long before Rome existed. Etruscan wine jars have turned up in France. Greek pottery appears in Etruscan tombs. Amber from the Baltic travelled south through trade routes that passed through the Italian peninsula. This was not a backwater waiting to be civilized. It was already a node in something larger, which makes what happened later all the more striking. When we say the Etruscans were erased, we don't exactly mean they were killed to the last person and their cities burned to ash, though sometimes cities were burned. We mean something subtler and in some ways more complete. They were absorbed. Their language was replaced. Their history was rewritten by people who found it convenient to remember them selectively. That kind of erasure can be harder to undo than fire. So who were they exactly? Where did the Etruscans actually come from? That question has been argued over for roughly 2,500 years, not just by modern scholars with their DNA analysis and stratigraphic data, but by the ancient Greeks and Romans themselves, people who were alive while Etruscan civilization was still flourishing. And the fact that they couldn't agree tells you something important about how complicated the answer might be. The oldest surviving account comes from Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE. He believed the Etruscans were migrants from Lydia, a kingdom in western Anatolia, roughly the western coast of what is now Turkey. His story goes like this. A great famine struck Lydia during the reign of a king named Attis. It went on for 18 years. Eventually the king divided his people into 2 groups, drew lots, and sent one half away to find a new homeland. They built ships, sailed west across the Mediterranean, and landed in Italy, where they settled and became the Etruscans. It's a vivid story. It has the shape of myth, but also the bones of something that might contain historical memory. Migration across the Mediterranean during periods of stress was genuinely common. People moved. Populations followed resources and opportunity, but not everyone accepted it even then. Dionysius of Halicarnassus, a Greek historian living in Rome several centuries after Herodotus, pushed back firmly. He argued that the Etruscans were not migrants at all. They were an indigenous people. They had always been in Italy, or as close to always as made any practical difference. He found the Lydian theory unpersuasive on cultural grounds. The Etruscans didn't speak a language related to Lydian. Their religious customs were different. Their way of life seemed to have developed from within Italy rather than having been transplanted from somewhere else. Dionysius concluded they were autochthonous, a word that means something like sprung from the earth itself, a native population with deep local roots. There was also a third theory floating around antiquity, less widely discussed but present in some ancient sources. The idea that the Etruscans had come from the north, crossing the Alps from somewhere in Central Europe. This Alpine origin story never gained much traction among ancient writers, but it occasionally reappears in later scholarship. So you have 3 competing ancient theories: migration from the east, indigenous development, arrival from the north. Modern scholarship has spent considerable energy trying to work out which, if any, of these gets it right. Archaeology leans heavily towards something like the Dionysius position, or at least toward continuity. The culture that preceded the Etruscans in central Italy is called the Villanovan culture, an Iron Age tradition that flourished in the region from roughly the 10th century BCE onward. Villanovan communities cremated their dead and stored the ashes in distinctive baconical urns, often buried under small mounds. They worked metal with skill, built substantial settlements, and participated in trade networks that connected them to the wider Mediterranean world. What the archaeological record shows is that Etruscan civilization appears to have grown out of Villanovan culture rather than replaced it. There isn't a sudden break in the material record, no layer of ash and destruction followed by different pottery and new burial styles arriving from somewhere else. Instead, there's a gradual transformation. Villanovan communities in certain regions of central Italy, particularly along the Tyrrhenian coast and in the river valleys of Tuscany, began elaborating their culture across the 8th and 7th centuries BCE. Settlements grew larger, social hierarchies became more pronounced, burials became more elaborate, moving from simple cremation urns to inhumation in richly furnished tombs. The influences coming in from the Greek colonies to the south and Phoenician traders from the east accelerated and shaped this development. But the foundation seems to have been local. That's what archaeology suggests. But genetics has entered the conversation more recently, and the picture it offers is both clarifying and humbling in equal measure. Studies of ancient DNA from Etruscan burial sites have shown results that complicate both the migration theory and the pure indigenous continuity model. Some analyses suggest meaningful genetic connections between certain Etruscan populations and populations from Anatolia or the eastern Mediterranean, which would seem to support Herodotus. But those same studies also show strong continuity with earlier Italian populations, which supports Dionysius. The honest answer from modern geneticists tends to be cautious. Migration and local development may not be mutually exclusive. A movement of people from the east, perhaps small in scale, perhaps arriving over generations rather than in a single fleet, could have blended with established Villanovan communities and contributed to the emergence of what we call Etruscan culture without displacing or replacing the existing population. There's something worth sitting with here. The very insistence on finding a single origin point may be the wrong way to approach the question. Cultures don't typically arrive fully formed from one place. They emerge at intersections. They grow in the friction between local traditions and outside influences. They take shape when particular groups of people, in a particular landscape, at a particular historical moment, start making choices about how to organize their societies, what gods to honor, what to put in a grave, how to build a city. The Etruscans may have been, in a very real sense, a product of their position, sitting in central Italy, facing the sea, connected to Greek and Phoenician networks while remaining rooted in older Italian traditions. Not purely native, not purely migrant, but something that formed from the mixing of all of it, shaped by the specific hills and rivers and harbours of Tuscany, into something recognizably its own. Whatever the answer turns out to be, the Etruscans became. And what they became was extraordinary. When we say Etruscan civilization, it's easy to picture a single kingdom, one great capital issuing orders that roll out across the peninsula. Our brains like neat hierarchies, empires, maps shaded in one colour with a clear border. But that isn't how Etruria worked. Instead of one Rome-like giant, what you had was a constellation, a cluster of city-states, each its own little universe, scattered across central Italy. Tarquini, Veii, Clusium, Vulci, Caere, Volterra, Perugia, Populonia, Orvieto, and many more. Each with its own walls, markets, temples, aristocratic families, and political dramas, each intensely local, endlessly negotiating its place among the others. These cities weren't suburbs of a centre. They were the centres. If you lived in Etruria, your identity, your obligations, your sense of who we were, probably focused on your city and its surrounding territory. You were a person of Tarquini, or a citizen of Caere. The word Etruscan would have meant something, but maybe in the way Italian did much later, a broader cultural label layered over very specific loyalties. This city-centred pattern isn't unique to the Etruscans. It shows up in Greece at roughly the same time, but Etruscan cities seem to have taken the idea and woven it into every part of life: politics, religion, economy, even the landscape itself. There was no permanent capital, no emperor clad in purple commanding a formal bureaucracy. Power moved sideways more than it moved up. Later Roman writers talk about an Etruscan League of 12 cities. They give it an old-sounding name, in Latin the Duodecim Populi Etruriae, 12 peoples of Etruria. It's one of those phrases that sounds simple until you look at it closely. What exactly was this league? Was it a fixed confederation, always the same 12 members, meeting on a regular schedule to make binding decisions? Or was 12 more of a symbolic number, a traditional way of saying the main cities, with membership shifting over time. Most modern scholars lean toward caution. They accept that some kind of league or leagues almost certainly existed. The written sources and the archaeological evidence around certain sanctuaries point in that direction. But the details are muddy. There may have been several leagues at different times, perhaps a northern one, a southern one, maybe even a loose coastal network focused on trade. The idea of a single, eternally stable 12-city confederation acting like a united federation is widely seen as too neat, too Romanized, possibly a retrojection. What does seem broadly accepted is this: Etruscan cities gathered in council for shared religious and political purposes. The heart of this, according to later tradition, was a sanctuary called the Fanum Voltumnae, a sacred grove and temple whose exact location is still debated. Some place it near modern Orvieto, others argue for different sites in inland Etruria. Wherever it was, ancient writers describe it as the meeting place of the Etruscan cities. Once a year, they say, delegates from the cities assembled there for religious ceremonies, games, and discussions of common affairs. It sounds a little like a pan-Italian festival, part pilgrimage, part diplomatic summit. Sacrifices and divination in the morning, political speeches and bargaining in the afternoon, feasting and athletic competitions as the sun went down. How formal were these meetings? Did they issue decrees, elect shared leaders, vote on war and peace? Here, again, the evidence is thin. Some historians think decisions about joint military campaigns could have been made at such gatherings. Others suspect the League's authority was mostly symbolic and religious, a ritual stage where the cities could display unity without surrendering much autonomy. Either way, the picture that emerges is of a civilization held together not by a single ruler, but by habits of assembly, by traditions of meeting in sacred space under the eyes of the gods to decide what should be done. Within each city, power was equally layered. Roman stories love the figure of the Etruscan king, the lucumo in some sources, a richly dressed ruler with an ivory throne, a purple-bordered robe, a bundle of rods carried before him as symbols of authority. This has fed the image of Etruscan cities as little monarchies. There were rulers, yes. In many places, especially in the earlier centuries, individual leaders seem to have held very strong executive power. Inscriptions mention magistracies and names that may be titles. Some tombs clearly belonged to people who wielded unusual influence. But even where a king existed, he did not rule alone in a vacuum. Elite families, powerful lineages, sat behind and around him like a living structure. Their estates ringed the city, their ancestors filled the richest tombs, their names repeated across generations in inscriptions and grave goods. They supplied the magistrates, the generals, the high priests. They lent money for public works, donated offerings to temples, and commanded loyalty from clients and dependents. We don't have minutes from an Etruscan council meeting, but the pattern that shows up in architecture, burials, and loanwords that filtered into Latin suggests something like an aristocratic council operated in many cities, a body of elders, heads of major families, capable of approving or blocking decisions, advising rulers, and perhaps in some periods choosing them. Over time, there are signs that power could shift from a single dominant ruler toward more collective magistracies, much as it did in early Rome when the monarchy fell. Offices held annually, held by two or more individuals at once, appear in inscriptions. You get the sense of a political landscape always in motion, balancing strong personalities against entrenched lineages and shared traditions. One of the most visible ways these elites expressed their power was in stone and earth and water. Etruscan cities did not simply grow like unplanned clusters of houses. There is clear evidence of intentional layout, the kind of urban planning that requires authority, coordination, and a long view. Many Etruscan settlements show regularized street grids, especially in later phases. Streets crossing at right angles, insular city blocks with consistent dimensions, public spaces carefully carved out at the centre. Archaeologists interpret this as planned expansion or refounding, sometimes over older Villanovan villages. Someone or some group decided where the main roads would run, where the marketplace would sit, where the temples would face. Outside the walls the land was carved up too. Boundary stones and field systems suggest thoughtful land division, probably managed or approved by civic authorities. Rural sanctuaries sat at crossroads and territorial edges, watching over fields that had been surveyed, parcelled, and assigned. This is not the work of a random clutch of farmers. It implies surveyors, standards of measurement, and a shared understanding of where one person's land ended and another's began. Beneath and around all of this, another kind of power was at work: control over water. Central Italy is a landscape of hills, valleys, and low-lying plains that can easily become marshes. Etruscan engineers seem to have made a specialty of drainage and hydraulic management. At sites like Veii, archaeologists have found complex systems of tunnels and channels, cut through rock to divert water away from vulnerable areas, to dry out fields, or to supply cisterns and fountains. In some cities you can still see the remains of massive earthworks, embankments, and culverts that reshaped the land. The later Romans admired and sometimes reused Etruscan drainage works. The famous draining of the Roman Forum's swampy valley, traditionally credited to the early kings, likely involved techniques learned from or carried out by Etruscan specialists. Roads tied this whole human-made landscape together. Not the straight, stone-paved imperial highways we associate with Rome, but earlier arteries, carefully traced routes linking city to city and city to hinterland. Some followed ridgelines, others cut through valleys on built-up embankments. Bridges and fords marked by shrines transformed dangerous crossings into tamed, ritualized points in the landscape. These projects did more than move goods and people. They were public statements. This land is organized. This water obeys human will. This city has the power to reshape its environment. And because elites funded, directed, and often commemorated these works, every road, drain, and wall also whispered a political message. Remember who made your fields dry and your streets passable. For the Etruscans, none of this was just secular civic management. The line between politics and religion, between infrastructure and ritual, simply didn't exist in the way it does for many of us now. Temples weren't tucked away in quiet corners. They dominated the urban skyline, raised on high podiums at the ends of main axes, facing plazas where people gathered. Their placement seems to follow orientations that may have had astronomical or divinatory significance. The very act of laying out a city could be understood as a religious rite, aligning human space with the will of the gods. Etruscan civic life moved to the rhythm of festivals. Certain days were marked for public sacrifices, for processions that wound through the streets, for games and banquets held at communal expense. The same men who debated policy or commanded troops also presided at altars, watched the flight of birds, and consulted liver-shaped models inscribed with the names of divine powers. When the cities met at the Fanum Voltumnae, it wasn't a secular parliament briefly pausing for a prayer. It was religion all the way down, and politics happening within that sacred frame. Decisions about war, alliance, or public building could be preceded by elaborate divination. The gods were asked for signs. Omens were read in lightning, in entrails, in celestial patterns. If the signs were unfavourable, action might be delayed or abandoned. If favourable, the decision gained a kind of cosmic endorsement. So when an Etruscan council approved a new temple, or authorised a drainage project, or agreed to support a neighbouring city in conflict, it wasn't just a matter of votes and budgets. It was a negotiation carried out in the presence of beings who were thought to care about the arrangement of fields, the line of city walls, the outcome of battles. In this way, the Etruscans built a different kind of power than the later Roman imperial model, less a single spear point thrust outward, more a woven net of cities, families, sanctuaries, and rituals. Authority circulated through councils and leagues, through priests and magistrates, through festival calendars and monumental works. From a distance, it might look messy. Up close, it starts to feel like an ecosystem. Multiple centres, each adapting, competing, cooperating, reshaping their piece of Italy according to a shared but locally inflected set of ideas about how human and divine order should fit together. And it was this web of cities, planned, drained, divided, consecrated, that opened onto something even larger. Because Etruscan power did not stop at their walls, it reached out across the sea. From those hilltop walls and drained valleys, the Etruscans turned outward toward the horizon line that mattered most, the sea. If you walked down from an inland city like Volterra or Perugia and followed the roads west, you wouldn't just reach a beach. You'd reach one of the most important front doors of the ancient Mediterranean, the Tyrrhenian coast. To the Greeks, that whole stretch of water was the Tyrrhenian Sea, named after the Tyrrhenoi, the Greeks' word for the Etruscans, That's already a clue. When another culture names an entire sea after you, it's usually because you're everywhere on it. The Etruscans didn't sit at home while ships from Greece and Phoenicia drifted in with exotic wares. They built and crewed their own fleets, and their coastal cities, Caere, Tarquini, Vulci, Populonia, Pisa, Gravisca, Pyrgi, became nodes in a dense web of routes that ran from the eastern Mediterranean all the way to the Atlantic. Imagine standing on a wooden pier at Caere's port. The air smells of pitch and salt and wet rope. Ships from Greek Massalia, from Corinth or Chios, from Phoenician outposts in Sardinia and North Africa, nudge up against vessels flying Etruscan standards. Languages overlap in the shouting of stevedores as cargo comes off in a steady stream. What's moving through these harbours? Metals, first of all. The Etruscans sat on one of the richest mineral belts in the central Mediterranean. Iron from Elba and Populonia, copper and lead from the inland hills, silver and perhaps traces of tin coming through their networks. Ore is heavy, bulky, and awkward to move over land. But pack it into the belly of a ship and suddenly you can feed bronze workshops from Sicily to southern France. Greek and Phoenician traders wanted those metals badly. In return, they brought objects that would reshape Etruscan taste and status. Fine painted pottery, olive oil, perfumed unguents, textiles, glass, worked ivory, intricate jewellery. Picture one such piece. A black figure Greek crater, a great mixing bowl for wine, its surface crowded with tiny painted figures of heroes, gods and monsters. It starts life in a workshop in Corinth or Athens. A potter throws it, a painter decorates it, a merchant buys it and loads it onto a ship. Weeks or months later, that same crater is being carefully lifted off a gangplank in an Etruscan harbour. It passes through the hands of a broker, maybe an Etruscan middleman who can speak a little Greek, makes the right gestures, knows how to flatter both sides. Eventually it ends up in the hall of an Etruscan aristocrat, where it might be used in feasts that borrowed Greek drinking customs, but gave them a distinctly Etruscan spin. Many of the most famous Greek vases in modern museums were actually found in Etruscan tombs. They left Greece as trade goods and survived in Italy as grave offerings, sealed in chambers that stayed dry for over 2,000 years. Our idea of classic Greek vase painting is, in a way, filtered through Etruscan buying habits. But the traffic wasn't one way. Etruscan workshops picked up foreign styles and transformed them. Take a bronze mirror, hold it in your mind. A polished disc of bronze catching candlelight, on its back a scene delicately engraved. Two figures seated across from each other, names written in curling Etruscan letters. Maybe they're Greek gods with Etruscan spellings, or local deities, or mythic heroes. The mirror is a Greekish object, made of imported metal and responding to Mediterranean fashions for personal grooming. But the style of the engraving, the language, the symbolic choices are Etruscan. These mirrors become luxury items that move along the same sea lanes that brought the raw metal in. Etruscan metalworkers weren't just feeding their own elites. They were good enough that some of their products travelled outward again, gifted, traded or looted into other cultures' collections. Gold jewellery tells a similar story. Tiny granules of gold fused into filigree patterns form rosettes, chains, and pendants of astonishing delicacy. Techniques like granulation, where hundreds of near-microscopic beads of gold are arranged in patterns, seem to reach a particular brilliance in Etruria. The gold itself might come from river places in Italy or abroad, but the transformation into shimmering, wearable status symbols that happens in Etruscan hands. Wine and oil form another part of this moving puzzle. Greeks brought wine and oil into Etruscan ports in sleek amphorae, tall clay jars with pointed bases. But the Etruscans weren't passive consumers. They adopted and adapted viticulture and olive cultivation. Before long, they were shipping their own wine, perhaps their own oil, along the coasts of Italy and beyond. Archaeologists have found Etruscan amphorae and other ceramics in places that might surprise you. Southern France, Corsica, Sardinia, even as far as Spain. In those finds, you can almost trace the wake of the ships that carried them. A cargo of wine or oil or salted goods heads west. Some amphorae stay in Massalia's warehouses, some in coastal villages, some move inland up river valleys, while the ship pushes on to the next port. The ports themselves become layered spaces, warehouses stacked with jars, courtyards where deals are struck, shrines where sailors leave offerings for safe passage. In places like Pyrgi, the port of Caere, sacred and commercial life interweave. One of the most famous Etruscan finds, the gold tablets of Pergae inscribed in both Etruscan and Phoenician, comes from a sanctuary right by the sea. On those tablets, a local ruler dedicates a temple to a goddess equated with Phoenician Astarte. It's a convergence point. Etruscan, Phoenician, and broader Mediterranean religious ideas overlapping in a spot where ships dock, cargo changes hands, and languages mingle. This trade didn't just enrich individual merchants. It poured wealth into city coffers and aristocratic estates, and that wealth left visible traces. The grand tumulus tombs near Tarquini and Cerveteri, the rock-cut necropolis with painted chambers, the large-scale temples with terracotta decoration, all of these cost resources, skilled labour, imported materials, time taken away from basic subsistence. Trade made that possible. Metals brought in through ports could be turned into tools for quarrying stone or carving rock, into nails and clamps for construction, into decorative fittings for wooden structures that have long since vanished. Exotic goods, ivory, amber, Egyptian faience, Greek vases, could be placed in tombs to signal status, to equip the dead with symbols of a life lived at the intersection of many worlds. Even the painted pottery itself, whether imported or locally made in Greek styles, becomes part of this loop. A symposium scene on a crater in a tomb doesn't just show people drinking, it silently testifies to the roots that connected that small burial chamber to artisans hundreds of miles away. But when a people dominates a sea, controls harbours, and sometimes checks what others can do on the water, the stories told about them tend to turn dark. Greek sources often talk about the Tyrrhenians with a mixture of respect and suspicion. In some accounts, they are traders. In others, they slide into the role of pirates. Tales circulate of Etruscan ships attacking Greek merchants, of captives seized and sold, of coastal raids. Later Roman writers inherit some of this tone. How much of that is literal history, and how much is the usual habit of labelling your rivals pirates whenever they interfere with your profits, is difficult to untangle. In the ancient Mediterranean, the line between merchant, privateer, and outright pirate was thin. A captain who traded peacefully one season might be hired the next by a city eager to harass a rival's shipping. A polity that controlled a choke point, a strait, an island chain, a stretch of coast, could levy dues on passing traffic. Those who paid called it customs. Those who refused called it extortion. It's entirely plausible that some Etruscan crews engaged in raiding when opportunities arose. It's also plausible that Greek and later Roman authors, competing with Etruscan cities for influence and markets, emphasized these stories, turning complex maritime competition into a simple, moral narrative. They are pirates. We are legitimate traders. When we read those texts today, it helps to remember that they come from neighbours and rivals. They show us how the Etruscans looked from the outside, not necessarily how the Etruscans would have described themselves. From the Etruscan perspective, what mattered most may have been control and negotiation, managing who could dock where, who could buy and sell which goods, who had the right to conduct business under the protection of which gods and which treaties. Ports, temples, aristocratic houses and ships all form parts of a single system. In this system, a painted Greek cup isn't just tableware. A bronze mirror isn't just a grooming aid. A gold necklace isn't just a pretty object. Each is a node in a network. All mined in one place, smelted in another, worked in a third, traded in a fourth, used in a fifth, buried in a sixth. Behind every object lies a chain of relationships, agreements, bargains, marriages, rivalries, that knit the Tyrrhenian world to the wider Mediterranean. By the time you stand again on that Etruscan quay at dusk, watching the last light fade off the water, you can almost hear those connections in the creak of hulls and the slap of waves against stone. The cities inland, with their councils and drains and gridded streets, are only half the story. The other half is out here, where the horizon is not a boundary, but a road, and the people who sail that road carry more than wine and metal. They carry ideas, images, beliefs, things that will shape how Etruscans imagine the afterlife, how they decorate their tombs, how they tell the story of what it means to live and die in a world open to the sea. Follow those ideas and objects inland again, away from the harbours and the smell of salt, and the landscape begins to change. The road passes vineyards and fields, climbs gentle ridges, and then, just when you expect open countryside, you find yourself in another kind of city. Not a city of the living, a city of the dead. Etruscan necropolises are often described that way, and the comparison isn't just poetic. At places like Cerveteri, Tarquini and Orvieto, the tombs stretch across the landscape in rows and clusters, laid out with a kind of planning that feels eerily familiar. Low earthen mounds line avenues that function almost like streets. Rock-cut chambers open one after another along lanes. Some tombs are grouped in blocks, belonging to extended families over generations. It's as if the Etruscans took the idea of a town and mirrored it underground. In some cases, they did exactly that. Walk into a rock-cut tomb at Cerveteri in your mind. You step down a short passage, and then the space opens into rooms carved to look like a house. Central hall, side chambers, a ceiling imitating wooden beams, benches shaped like beds lining the walls. Instead of mattresses and blankets, there are stone platforms for the dead. Instead of household clutter, there are vases, jewellery, weapons, tools, arranged with careful intent. To us, this is a burial. To the people who made it, it may have been closer to a home, a place where the dead continued in some form the patterns of life. And because they equipped these tomb houses so thoroughly, they left us an accidental archive. Archaeologists joke, a little grimly, that Etruscan daily life survives best in their cities of the dead. Walls and roofs of living houses have mostly vanished, eaten by time, reused, or buried under later buildings. But the tombs, covered in earth and sealed, preserved a curated version of what an Etruscan household valued. Open a chamber, and you might find storage jars, cooking pots, drinking sets, lamps, weapons laid beside a man's body, or at least beside where it once rested, spindles and jewellery near a woman, children's burials with toys or miniature objects. Each item is a clue, not just to how they died, but to how they lived. Sometimes the tombs hold something else, painting. Tarquini, in particular, became famous in antiquity for its painted graves. Many of those paintings are fragile now, faded, damaged the moment they were exposed to air, but enough survives to offer a window into a world of colour and movement. One chamber shows a banquet. Recline on one of those carved stone couches in your imagination. The walls around you come alive. Men and women share the same couches, propped on their elbows in the Greek fashion, but the atmosphere feels distinct. Their skin is painted in different tones, often reddish for men, paler for women, a convention inherited and adapted from other Mediterranean art. Servants move between them, carrying jugs and cups. Musicians play double pipes or strum lyres. Dancers leap and twist. The dead person whose ashes or bones rested here is surrounded, not by scenes of grief, but by perpetual feasting. Other rooms show games and athletics. In one, young men compete in races. Another depicts wrestlers grappling, or boxers with hands wrapped. Horses and chariots hurtle past in tiny painted friezes, echoing the great spectacles that once filled Etruscan arenas and fields. There are hunting scenes too, figures aiming spears at birds or wild animals, dogs tensed in pursuit. In some tombs, the walls are patterned to suggest open-air pavilions, garden trellises or tent awnings, blurring the line between indoors and outdoors, between celebration and commemoration. And then there are the quieter images, couples exchanging a look, parents with children, groups of people raising cups in toasts that will never quite be spoken. Sometimes the inscriptions give names, a fragment of identity, anchored in paint and stone. What did all this mean? Modern scholars tread carefully here. We don't have an Etruscan holy book. We don't have their own explanations of what these images signified, but the patterns are suggestive. Again and again, tomb paintings show activities of elite life, dining, music, sport, family gatherings. Perhaps for those commissioned to decorate these spaces, the good life on earth flowed naturally into whatever came next. If you were wealthy and well-connected, you might have imagined your existence continuing in some refined, idealized version of your own world. The same friends, the same entertainments, the same honour. In some chambers, though, a different mood appears at the edges. Look past the banqueters and athletes, and you sometimes see figures that don't quite fit the everyday. Winged beings, hybrid creatures, stern guardians standing near doors or at the borders of scenes. These have often been interpreted as protective spirits or guides of the dead. Later, Roman and Greek writers mention Etruscan beliefs in powerful underworld deities, and some of the names from inscriptions like Charoon and Vanth have been linked to certain painted figures with hooked noses, hammers, or wings. It's possible that, in Etruscan thought, the journey after death involved encounters with these beings, entities who could open gates, escort souls, ward off dangers. But because we're building this picture from images and a scattering of texts, every interpretation carries some uncertainty. What we can say is that the walls combine celebration with hints of transition and otherworldly presence. The objects placed in tombs add another layer to this story. Grave goods vary enormously. Some burials are modest, a few simple pots, maybe a piece of jewellery or an iron knife. Others are overwhelming. Chamber tombs have been found with sets of bronze cauldrons, stands, candelabra, imported Greek vases by the dozens, finely worked gold, ivory inlays, chariots, or their fittings laid carefully in place. This range reflects status in a fairly direct way. Some people died with the markers of immense wealth and influence, others with the bare minimum. The dead, in Etruria, continued to participate in social hierarchy. But the goods tell us more than rich and poor. They sketch outlines of taste. In some tombs, sets of tableware are arranged with almost obsessive completeness. Cups, plates, strainers, ladles, mixing bowls, all coordinated. Elsewhere, you see a preference for certain imported shapes, Attic kylikes, Corinthian ribaloi, or for locally made bronzes decorated with particular motifs. Choices about what to bury seem to respond to fashion, to personal identity, to ideas about what was appropriate or necessary for the dead. A warrior might go into the tomb with a finely decorated helmet. A woman might be accompanied by elaborate fibulas and necklaces. These decisions create a kind of silent biography. They also map long-distance connections. When archaeologists catalogue the goods in an Etruscan tomb, they sometimes end up tracing the object's life backwards. A piece of amber turns out to come from the Baltic. A scarab is Egyptian in style, perhaps imported via Phoenician traders. A painted cup reveals a workshop signature from Athens. A bronze vessel shows parallels with pieces in Central Europe. Each of those items had to travel through multiple hands across multiple cultures before ending up in that specific chamber. The dead man or woman buried there, even if they never left Etruria, lived in a world where things and ideas moved along vast routes. When you stand back and look across many tombs, the patterns sharpen. In early periods, cremation urns might be shaped like little huts, hinting at an older style of dwelling, and perhaps an older conception of the household. Later, as wealth and urbanization increase, tombs become more elaborate. Grave goods become more plentiful and more international. Imagery reflects contact with Greek myths and orientalizing motifs. By tracking which goods appear where and when, archaeologists can watch families rise and fall, fashions spread and fade, trade links strengthen and weaken. They can see, for example, that certain imported luxuries cluster in specific necropolises at certain times, suggesting that one city had the stronger diplomatic or economic ties to a particular region. And they can watch beliefs shift subtly. Over the centuries, the balance of scenes in tomb paintings changes. Early emphasis on joyous banquets might give way in some places to more sombre or complex underworld imagery. New figures appear, old ones become more prominent. Without text to explain why, we read these changes as signs of evolving ideas about death and whatever lay beyond it. All of this depends on a certain kind of patience. A single tomb is like a short story with most of its pages missing. A necklace here, a broken cup there, a faded figure on a wall. You could easily overinterpret or miss the point entirely. But when hundreds, even thousands of burials are recorded, compared and mapped, patterns start to emerge that no single tomb could reveal. Archaeology in this sense becomes a way of listening to an extinct language of objects. Where we lack words, we lean on repetition. If banquets appear in tomb after tomb, in city after city, across generations, that tells us something about the importance of feasting in marking status, and perhaps in thinking about death. If certain protective figures always occupy the thresholds of painted spaces, that position probably mattered. If particular imported goods cluster in high-status graves, they likely carried recognized prestige. Even so, there are things we may never know. What stories did Etruscan parents tell their children about those winged beings on the walls? What jokes were shared at the funerary banquets held outside these tombs before they were sealed? What songs were sung as the last light from torches flickered over fresh paint? The tombs hold their silence on those questions, but they don't feel empty. They feel like rooms paused mid-scene, cups raised, musicians frozen mid-note, lovers mid-glance. They give us, in these still images and buried objects, enough to sense that Etruscan life was rich, textured, full of ceremony and play and care for the dead, and the same people who built and decorated these underground houses for the departed were also looking upward, watching birds and lightning, taking omens from the sky and the entrails of sacrificed animals, trying to understand a universe they believed was ordered, but never entirely predictable. If you follow those gazes upward, away from the tomb walls and the painted feasts, you end up in a different kind of architecture. Not carved out of rock this time, but traced in the air. The Etruscans, at least as later Romans remembered them, were specialists in reading the will of the gods. So specialized, in fact, that for centuries Etruscan and expert in divination were almost interchangeable terms in Roman writing. But here we have to pause. Most of what we think we know about Etruscan religion comes second-hand. Roman authors summarizing, quoting, or sometimes arguing with a system they had partly adopted and partly reshaped. The original Etruscan manuals, if they were ever written on anything permanent, have not survived. What we're left with are fragments, all of them filtered through foreign eyes and later reconstructions. Even so, the outlines are suggestive. Roman writers talk about something they call the disciplina Etrusca, the Etruscan discipline. It wasn't discipline in the modern sense of behavior control. It was more like a complete sacred science, a body of rules, techniques, and interpretations that taught practitioners how to recognize and understand signs sent by the gods. The idea, as far as we can reconstruct it, was that the universe was saturated with meaning. Thunder wasn't just weather. A bird's sudden flight across the sky wasn't just animal behavior. The liver of a sacrificed sheep wasn't just an organ. Each of these could be a message if you knew how to read it. And reading it correctly was not a casual talent. It was a learnable, structured skill. One major branch of this sacred science dealt with entrails, especially the liver. Later Romans give it a Greek name, haruspice. Imagine an Etruscan ritual specialist. Again, we imagine, because the original scenes are gone and we're borrowing details from later depictions. An animal is sacrificed, the body opened, and the liver lifted out as if it were a map. To us, it looks like an irregular mass of tissue. To them, it seems to have been laid out as a diagram of the cosmos. A famous bronze model from Piacenza, probably made in northern Etruria, gives us a hint of how this worked. It's a small bronze liver, covered in inscriptions, its surface divided into sections with gods' names written in each one. Scholars debate exactly how it was used, but the basic principle appears clear. Each region of the liver corresponded to a region of the sky and to particular deities. When a lump, a mark, a discoloration showed up in a certain part of the liver, it wasn't random. It meant that a specific god, associated with that zone, was sending a sign about a specific area of life or fate. The haruspice, literally the entrail watcher in Latin, had to match the physical detail to the right portion of this invisible chart. That chart, though, was not just about anatomy. Underlying it was a deeper pattern the Romans later called the templum. Not temple, as in a building, but temple as in a sacred space that had been cut out and defined within the chaos of the world. This cutting and defining was itself a central act. In Latin, to consecrate often involved to inaugurate, to mark out and approve a piece of territory as suitable for divine human contact. Rome almost certainly learned this practice from Etruscan specialists, and it seems to have been rooted in an Etruscan way of thinking, that the sky above and the land below could be divided into corresponding sectors, like slices of an enormous celestial pie. Imagine the vault of the heavens divided into regions of influence. Each god, each category of divine force had its own slice. When lightning flashed or birds flew through a certain part of that sky, the observer knew which divine zone had just been activated. The world, in this view, was not a random dome. It was a grid of power. To make that grid usable, it had to be projected downward. So ritual experts templated the earth. They stood in a chosen spot, oriented themselves with care, often facing south, so that east lay to the left and west to the right, and then extended lines out into the landscape, mentally and sometimes physically. This act created a templum on the ground, a sacred rectangle or square whose internal divisions mirrored those of the sky. Once that was done, you could take the auspices. birds that crossed your field of vision didn't just fly from left to right. They moved from one divine sector to another, carrying meaning with them. A lightning bolt that struck in a particular direction didn't just hit a tree, it landed in a named, understood portion of sacred space. Temples in the architectural sense seem to echo this way of thinking. Many Etruscan sanctuaries were laid out with a strong axial orientation, often with carefully defined fronts, backs and side zones that later Roman authors associate with particular deities. Jupiter in one segment, Tinia, his Etruscan counterpart, in another, more shadowy underworld powers in yet another. When we read those Roman descriptions, it's easy to forget how radical the underlying idea is. In this worldview, religion isn't just about pleasing potentially fickle gods. It's about participating in a system where time, space, and divine intention are all arranged according to a knowable pattern. You don't guess what the gods want. You're trained to read the signs that reveal what they have already decided and then to adjust human plans accordingly. This is where the Etruscan discipline becomes both reassuring and unsettling. On one hand, it suggests an ordered universe. The gods have a plan. The sky's divided. The signs are there. Human beings are not adrift in chaos. They can learn, consult, and respond. On the other hand, it implies that human freedom is limited. Important events, victories, disasters, the founding of cities, unfold within a larger framework that can be predicted, may be delayed, perhaps negotiated with through ritual, but not entirely escaped. Later Roman sources even hint that Etruscan sages believed in a kind of cosmic timetable, that peoples and cities had allotted spans of existence, measured in ages or secular, announced and periodically renewed by prodigies and omens. Rome itself, in some Roman tellings, submitted to being measured by this Etruscan clock. How much of this goes back to early Etruscan belief, and how much was shaped by Roman anxiety about their own future is hard to say. This is one of those places where our evidence is so mediated, so heavily filtered through later lenses, that modern historians tend to speak in cautious terms. Perhaps, it appears, some have suggested. What is clearer is that the Romans, pragmatic as they often present themselves, took Etruscan sacred science very seriously. By the late Republic, Rome had formal colleges of haruspices who could be called on by the Senate whenever something strange happened. A statue toppled for no apparent reason, an animal was born with two heads, lightning struck a temple on a cloudless day. These experts, frequently described as Etruscan, or at least following Etruscan methods, would consult their books, examine victims, and issue opinions on what the gods were communicating. Alongside them stood the augurs, another priestly college responsible for watching the flight of birds and other signs in the sky. The technical language they used, the way they marked out the templum in which they observed omens, and the very concept that the sky was divided into meaningful sectors, all seem to owe a deep debt to Etruscan models. Even at the highest levels of Roman public life, decisions could not be taken without checking in some way what these systems had to say. Elections, laws, wars, the founding of colonies, many of these were accompanied by auspices or other forms of divination whose procedures, at least in origin, carried an Etruscan imprint. And yet, what Rome adopted was already a translation. By the time we meet the Disciplina Etrusca in our written sources, it has been filtered first through Roman practice, then through Greek philosophical categories, then through the tastes and anxieties of late Republican and imperial authors. Pieces of the system were preserved in Latin summaries, in antiquarian works, in paraphrases that aim to fit Etruscan notions into Greek-style theology. The original ritual handbooks, if they ever existed in Etruscan script on durable material, are gone. We don't have an Etruscan priest explaining, in his own words, how he understood the gods of the lightning-bearing sky, or why a mark on the lower left of a liver mattered more than a mark on the upper right. What we see instead is a shadow, a Romanized version of Etruscan sacred science, preserved mostly because it proved useful, or strange, or impressive, to a culture that eventually conquered and absorbed its inventors. It is entirely possible that important elements never made that journey. Maybe there were myths that gave emotional colour to these procedures, stories about the first human who learned to read livers, or the god who first traced the sky's divisions with a bolt of fire. Maybe there were local variations, household rituals, quietly maintained practices that never interested Roman chroniclers, and so left no trace at all. What survives in the texts feels almost disconcertingly dry. Rules, classifications, case histories of bad omens and what happened when they were ignored. It has the flavour of a technical manual stripped of its narrative frame. And yet even that skeletal outline hints at a way of inhabiting the world. To live inside the Etruscan discipline, as far as we can imagine it, was to move through a landscape that was never entirely mundane. Every unusual occurrence might be a message. Every boundary could double as a cosmic line. A temple wasn't just a building, it was a calibrated intersection of heaven and earth. The same people who carved joyful banquets on tomb walls, who sent their dead into elaborately furnished houses beneath the soil, spent their lives under a sky they believed was inscribed with intention. They built, traded, feasted, and mourned, while watching birds cross invisible sectors and listening for thunder in particular quarters of the horizon. Rome would inherit much of this apparatus, refine it, bureaucratize it, and write it down in its own language. But what we glimpse, in outline, behind the Latin words and later interpretations, is an older vision. An Italian people who tried to align their cities and their choices with a cosmos they thought was speaking, all the time, if only you knew how to listen. And if the Roman versions are only a filtered echo of that belief, they are still enough to suggest that, for the Etruscans, religion was not merely a matter of private comfort or public spectacle. It was a disciplined, almost scientific attempt to map the unknown, to place human life within patterns drawn across the sky and written, briefly, in the entrails of animals and the flight of birds. Beyond that, the gods keep their secrets. The manuals are lost. The specialists are long gone. What remains are traces: a bronze liver, a few Latin summaries, temple foundations aligned to an invisible grid, and scattered across the hills and plains of ancient Etruria, the cities where this sacred science was woven into everyday life, into law and politics and the planning of streets, cities that would soon find themselves entangled with an ambitious neighbour, whose own destiny, if the Etruscan sages were right, was already marked in the sky. For all their attention to signs, the Etruscans have left us one of the most stubbornly opaque signs of all: their own language. We can see it. We can pronounce it, at least approximately. We can even understand little pockets of it, names, titles, repeated phrases that behave themselves, but when we try to step beyond those safe shallows into full sentences, into stories, into thoughts, the water deepens very fast. The problem is only partly about quantity, though quantity is a problem. Latin left us libraries, Greek left us epics, histories, plays, Etruscan left us scraps. There are tomb inscriptions, some only a few words long, dedications on votive offerings, labels on mirrors and small bronzes, a handful of longer texts, but most of what survived is short, formulaic, carved on stone or painted on pottery. The daily conversations, the laws debated in councils, the prayers said at household shrines, the myths told by firelight, those all vanished with the perishable materials they were probably written or spoken on. And then there is the other, deeper difficulty. Etruscan does not belong, as far as we can tell, to the big Indo-European family that includes Latin, Greek, Celtic, Germanic, and many of the languages of modern Europe and South Asia. It sits apart in a tiny cluster sometimes called Tersenian, with a couple of distant relatives, the language of Lemnos in the Aegean, known from a single inscription, and maybe a ghost of a tongue remembered in later sources from the Alps. That means the usual tricks that historical linguists love, lining up words in Latin and Greek and Sanskrit, watching sound changes unfold in regular patterns, don't give us much traction here. There is no Etruscan version of mater/meter/mother, pointing politely at the word for mother. Often, when we stare at an Etruscan sentence, we're doing it without the comfort of a big related family to lean on, and yet it isn't a complete darkness. We have a key, even if it doesn't open every door. The Etruscans wrote with an alphabet that is clearly related to early Greek. You can see it in the shapes of the letters on stone and bronze. Some look comfortably familiar, others are like Greek letters seen in a slightly warped mirror. Most scholars think the Etruscans adapted a Western Greek script, probably from Greek settlers in southern Italy or on coastal islands, sometime in the early 1st millennium BCE, and then bent it to fit the sounds of their own speech. Learning to read Etruscan aloud, therefore, is not the hardest part. Once you know the values of the letters, you can walk through an inscription sounding out Mia Vilesh, I Avil, or clan, son, or Zilath, a term that seems to mean something like magistrate or official. That adaptation of the Greek alphabet is itself a story. It tells us that writing travelled along real human networks, trade routes, coastal contacts, shared sanctuaries where Greek and Etruscan sailors might have left offerings side by side. A set of abstract symbols, born in the eastern Mediterranean out of older Phoenician shapes, crossed the sea and took root in central Italy, where it was trimmed and pruned and made to serve a different tongue. From that Etruscan script parent, later Italic alphabets seem to have borrowed. Early Latin letters, scratched on pots from archaic Rome, carry traces of Etruscan influence in their forms and in the direction of writing. So when you look at the familiar ABC of the Roman alphabet, you are walking along a path that ran through Etruscan hands before it ever reached English or any modern language using those shapes. But an alphabet only gives you sounds. Understanding comes from patterns. Over the last century and more, scholars have catalogued and compared every Etruscan inscription they can find. They have noticed which words cluster together in tombs, which in temple contexts, which appear on boundary stones or mirrors or dice. Out of this enormous sorting exercise, a small but solid core of understanding has emerged. We can recognize personal names, many of them, and the way family relationships are marked: X clan, Y, X, son of Y. We can spot words that behave like dedicated, offered, sacred to. We can identify numbers in certain contexts, especially on objects like dice and in a few lists. There are terms for officials and political roles, Zilath, mentioned earlier, and others, that we know are titles, even when we are not completely sure how to render them in modern languages. We can also trace a few formulaic phrases that repeat from one monument to another, especially in funerary contexts. There are patterns that mean, in effect, this is the tomb of, this was made for, he or she lived, though the exact shades of meaning are still topics of careful debate. And then there are a few extraordinary artifacts where Etruscan suddenly feels, if not transparent, then at least less opaque. Among them, a small set of gold sheets found by the sea. At the port sanctuary of Pergi, on the coast of southern Etruria, archaeologists uncovered 3 thin gold tablets in the 1960s, buried carefully within a temple area. 2 are inscribed in Etruscan, 1 in Phoenician. All 3 date to around the late 6th or early 5th century BCE, and they appear to be related versions of a dedication made by a local ruler. Because Phoenician is a well-understood Semitic language, the Phoenician tablet gives us a parallel text to compare with the Etruscan ones. The match is not line for line, but close enough that certain Etruscan words light up when set beside their Phoenician counterparts. From Pergi we learn the name of the dedicator, often identified as Theferi Velianas, a king or chief of the city of Caer. We learn, or at least gain strong indications, of the goddess involved, a figure related to the Phoenician Astarte. We see in both languages concepts of dedicating, of building, of pious acts tied to political status. The tablets do not suddenly make Etruscan easy. There are still phrases in the Etruscan version whose exact meaning is debated, grammatical forms that don't have neat equivalents, but the presence of that Phoenician neighbour gives us anchor points, fixed stars in a sky of otherwise mostly unknown constellations. Other objects perform similar, if smaller, services. The bronze liver from Piacenza, with its labelled sections, helps clarify divine names and possibly terms for cosmic divisions. A long text written on linen, later cut up and reused as mummy wrappings in Egypt, then recovered in the modern era, gives us the longest continuous Etruscan text known, probably some kind of ritual calendar or liturgy. Its repetitive, formulaic nature suggests that priests read or chanted from such texts, though the detailed content is still far from fully understood. In each of these cases we are certain about some things, cautiously confident about others, and openly unsure about many. Scholars tend to distinguish carefully between what is securely established, the reading of individual letters and most phonetic values, the identification of many proper names, the general sense of certain stock phrases, and what remains in the realm of hypothesis, the finer points of syntax, the exact meaning of rare words, the nuances of style or metaphor. This uncertainty is not just an academic inconvenience. It has consequences for how fully we can meet the Etruscans on their own terms. When you can read a people's texts fluently, you can listen to their arguments, laugh at their jokes, feel their anxieties in their own words. With Etruscan, we are often stuck at the surface. This is a name, this is a title, this is probably a formula of offering or commemoration. The inner voice of the culture, its self-descriptions and self-criticisms, stays mostly behind a translucent screen. Over time, That kind of silence contributes powerfully to what later looks like erasure. Roman authors tell us about Etruscan kings, Etruscan diviners, Etruscan luxuries and vices. Greek writers mention Tyrrhenians on the seas. Archaeology gives us walls, tombs, jewellery, painted banquets, terracotta statues of gods and worshippers. But the Etruscans themselves, speaking directly in long stretches of text, are almost never there. Instead, a pattern repeats. The Romans borrow an Etruscan practice, adapt an Etruscan god's name, inherit an Etruscan letter shape. They translate what is useful into Latin and let the rest slowly fade. Without a continuous written tradition that later Italians could easily read, Etruscan became, within a few generations of Roman political dominance, a learned curiosity, then a mystery, then a rumour of a language. Some ancient sources already speak of it as a tongue that only specialists knew, or that was no longer fully understood. By the time medieval scholars looked back toward antiquity, Etruscan words appearing in Latin texts had become enigmatic, stray fossils embedded in a Roman sediment. Language, in this sense, is one of the strongest threads tying a culture across time. When that thread snaps, when children stop learning a language, when no one copies its books, when no later tradition keeps it alive in liturgy or law, an enormous amount of experience falls into a kind of internal exile. Material things can survive being conquered. A temple can be rededicated. A road can be repaved. Even religious techniques like the Etruscan discipline of divination can be borrowed and renamed. But language, if it dies without descendants who remember it, takes away the running commentary that explains why those temples mattered, how those roads were imagined, what those rituals felt like from the inside. With Etruscan, we are balanced right on that edge. We are not completely shut out. We can read enough to recognize people's names, to see family lines, to notice that a certain woman held a particular title, that a man dedicated a statue to a god on a certain day. We can trace the movement of the alphabet from Greek shores to Italian hills and watch it transform along the way. We can glimpse, through the Pergi tablets and other bilingual hints, the outlines of a political and religious vocabulary. But beyond that, the noise deepens. Whole categories of expression, the rhythm of speeches, the texture of everyday letters, the way humour worked, remain largely inaudible. This quiet is part of how an entire civilization can be present in stone and yet feel, from the standpoint of later ages, almost absent. Rome's roads, laws, and language marched across Italy and then across an empire, carrying themselves forward through the centuries. Etruria's words mostly stopped at the early imperial frontier of memory, and yet if you look closely, the alphabet on this page, the letters arranging your thoughts as you drift towards sleep, still bear faint traces of hands that once carved different sounds into stone. The Etruscans are gone, their sentences broken and scattered, but the tools they used to write them are still in our own mouths and on our own screens, quietly insisting that even the most erased cultures leave something behind. Those letters, and the few phrases we can still decipher, will follow us into Rome itself, into stories of kings and revolutions, of neighbours who became rulers, and of a city that rose while another people's words were already falling into silence. When Roman writers finally sit down centuries later to explain where their city came from, they do something very Roman. They tell a story in which Rome is both humble and already important. A frontier town of shepherds and bandits, they say, rough and poor and scrappy, and yet somehow this little settlement attracts kings with foreign names, masters of a more ancient, more polished culture. In their version, the earliest kings are Latin and Sabine, men from neighbouring hill peoples who fight, make treaties, build the first walls and forums, but by the time we reach the last three kings in the traditional list, the names shift. Lucius Tarquinius Priscus, Servius Tullius, Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, the Tarquins. Later Romans call them Etruscan kings. How much of that is memory, how much is legend, and how much is a way of explaining visible facts, the architecture in the ground, the rituals still being performed in their own day, has been argued ever since modern historians took up the puzzle. But if you walk through the layers of archaic Rome with a patient eye, you begin to see why the story took the shape it did. Archaeology suggests that, by the 7th and 6th centuries BCE, Rome was not just a cluster of huts on one hill. It had become a real player in central Italy. The low-lying ground between the hills, the future forum, was being drained and paved. Monumental temples went up. Imported luxury goods flowed in, Greek pottery, fine bronzes, carved ivory. Burials from this period show elites living and being buried in ways that look, in many respects, Etruscan. Imagine Rome in this phase as a kind of hinge city. To the north, the heartlands of Etruria, Veii, Caere, Tarquini, rich in metal, trade, and ritual prestige. To the south, the Latins and the Greek colonies of Campania. Rome sat on a river with access to the sea, on roads that connected the Tyrrhenian coast to the inland routes of the Apennines. It was not yet the master of Italy. It was one more node in a dense network of cities and peoples, but it was a node in a very good place. In that position, it makes sense that ambitious men from powerful Etruscan families might cross the Tiber and involve themselves in Roman politics, in marriage alliances, in military pacts. It makes sense that Roman elites might borrow clothes, symbols, and religious specialists from neighbours who were already famous for their wealth and their mysterious sacred science. The Roman tradition compresses all of this into the figures of the Tarquin kings. Lucius Tarquinius Priscus, the first Tarquin in the story, is said to have come from Tarquinii in Etruria, married to a woman named Tanaquil, herself portrayed as an expert in interpreting signs. In the narrative, she reads omens that mark her husband out for greatness, schemes to get him the throne, and later recognizes through another omen that Servius Tullius is destined to rule. Whether these particular people ever existed in precisely this way is impossible to prove, but the pattern they embody, Etruscan-linked elites bringing diviners and royal ceremony into Rome, fits what we see across the region. Etruscan cities were already staging grand processions, elaborate temple dedications, and carefully calibrated public spectacles. The idea that Rome learned to dress its politics in similar clothing is not far-fetched. Some of the clothing, in a literal sense, we can still identify. The purple-bordered toga worn by Roman magistrates, the ivory cella curulis, the folding curule chair of high office, the rod and axe bundle carried before certain officials, all of these, Roman authors insist, came to Rome from Etruscan kings. Later, antiquarians traced the lictors, the attendants who bore those bundles, back to Etruscan models. That rod and axe bundle, the fasces, is one of the clearest shadows. In Etruscan art we see bundles of rods tied around an axe, symbols of magisterial power and the right to punish. At Rome, those fasces become the portable emblem of imperium, the lawful command of magistrates and kings. Centuries later, when the monarchy is gone, consuls and dictators still parade through the streets with fasces before them, as if the ghost of Etruscan-style kingship has been chopped up and sewn into the uniform of a republic. Augury, the reading of the will of the gods through the flight of birds and other signs, is another discipline that Romans themselves say they learned from Etruria. They developed their own mythology of Etrusca Disciplina, the Etruscan discipline, a body of secret lore about omens, lightning, and sacrifices, preserved in books and guarded by specialist families. Roman augurs, standing on a hilltop marking out the templum of the sky with their staff and watching for birds, are reenacting a systematized version of something that seems to have matured earlier just over the river. At some point, perhaps in the 7th or 6th century BCE, Rome did not just adopt an Etruscan alphabet, it adopted, or adapted, Etruscan ways of talking to the gods. Architecture tells a similar story. The great temple of Jupiter, Optimus Maximus on the Capitoline Hill, traditionally dedicated at the very end of the regal period, is described in Roman sources as enormous, richly decorated, and built with the help of Etruscan artisans. They say the famous terracotta statue on its roof, a huge figure of Jupiter in a quadriga, was the work of Vulca of Veii, an Etruscan sculptor. We cannot see that original statue. The temple itself was rebuilt many times after fires. But archaeologists have uncovered foundations and fragments that confirm a large monumental temple on the Capitoline in the late 6th century BCE, built in a style that shares many features with Etruscan temple architecture. A deep front porch, a strong emphasis on the facade terracotta decoration. Elsewhere in the city, the Cloaca Maxima, the great drainage canal, is traditionally linked to the Tarquins as well. The story says that Tarquinius Priscus or Tarquinius Superbus undertook the huge labour of draining the marshy lowlands between the hills, channeling water out to the Tiber and shaping the space that would become the Roman Forum. Again, the precise royal name attached to the project is debated, but the engineering itself is real. Massive stonework from this archaic drainage system still lies under the later layers. It is one of those works that only a coordinated and probably coercive central authority could organise. A king, or at least someone acting very much like one. From these building projects, from borrowed symbols and shared craftsmen, a picture emerges. Early Rome as a kind of apprentice city. It watches its richer, older neighbours in Etruria and beyond. It sees how they stage power, how they bind city and gods together through architecture and ritual. It notices that a city which can pave a public square, raise a monumental temple, and parade magistrates beneath gleaming fascias, is a city that looks permanent, even if its walls are still not very thick. In this apprenticeship, spectacle is not a side effect. It is a tool. Later Roman tradition credits the kings, again particularly those with Etruscan ties, with introducing formal games and public entertainments. The earliest gladiatorial contests, which begin as funerary displays among Italian elites, have parallels in Etruscan tomb paintings where armed men fight in front of gathered onlookers. Chariot racing, with its closed oval tracks and roaring crowds, is also associated with Etruscan models. Rome, standing on its hills by the Tiber, learns that power is not only about soldiers and walls. It is about orchestrating what people see and hear, processions, sacrifices, games. It is about turning religious ritual into a kind of theatre, in which the ruling elite plays the starring roles. At the same time, the city is absorbing subtler practices. The very idea that office can be symbolised by chairs, rods, garments, and that these symbols can be passed from person to person along with authority, is part of this Etruscan shadow. The Romans will later insist that their republic has no king, but their consuls will sit on curule chairs, wear purple stripes, consult augurs, and be preceded by lictors with fasces in a way that would have looked very familiar to a 6th century Etruscan noble. Underneath the myths of kings murdered on stairways and boys with flaming heads, there runs a quieter continuity. Techniques of rulership, wrapped in religious legitimacy, borrowed and then naturalized. Yet if Rome is the student in this relationship, it is not a passive one. From the archaeological side, we see Roman elites of this period buried with weapons, with imported goods from both Etruria and the Greek world, sitting at the crossroads of multiple cultures and choosing what to copy, what to resist, what to transform. The city's very position on the frontier, between Latin and Etruscan, between central Italian hill cultures and Mediterranean sea lanes, gives it options. It can look north to Veii and Caer for temple forms and diviners. It can look south to Campanian Greeks for alphabet shapes, vase styles, ideas about gods told in different stories. It can take the Etruscan way of organising priests and combine it with Latin traditions of clan and assembly. Bit by bit, Rome is not just imitating, it is remixing. Later, when Rome and Etruscan cities clash, Roman writers will look back uneasily on the Age of Kings. They will paint the Tarquins in dark colours, arrogant, luxurious, tyrannical. It is hard not to hear underneath those stories a kind of retrospective discomfort. The symbols of law and order that every Roman magistrate still uses were, in their own telling, once the regalia of foreign kings. A question begins to form, even if the sources do not ask it directly. How did a city that learned its letters, temples, augurs, and fasces from Etruscan neighbours end up conquering those same neighbours? How did the apprentice become the rival, and then the master? What happened on that frontier, in wars and alliances and betrayals, that turned the shadow of Etruscan power from a shelter into a silhouette that Rome felt it had to step out of, and eventually erase? To follow that trail, we have to leave the Age of Kings behind and watch Rome and Etruria meet each other, not just in shared rituals and borrowed symbols, but on battlefields. The quiet exchange of culture will give way to sieges and treaties, victories and losses, and to a very different kind of story about how one civilization absorbs another. When we step out of that world of shared craftsmen and borrowed regalia, we find the same cities facing each other across a harder landscape. By the 6th century BCE, Etruscan power is not just a matter of temples and augurs. It is fleets on the Tyrrhenian Sea, garrisons in strategic passes, alliances with cities far beyond their old heartland between the Arno and the Tiber. For a time, it looks as though Etruscan influence might stitch together almost the whole of the Italian peninsula. To the north, Etruscan communities press up into the Po Valley, what the ancients call Cisalpine Gaul. Cities like Felsina, later Bologna, sprout Etruscan-style elites, Etruscan inscriptions, Etruscan grave goods. They sit astride the routes that lead over the Alps and out toward the wider European world, a new frontier for metals and slaves and amber. To the south, Etruscan city leagues reach down into Campania. Capua, in later Roman memory a wealthy and pleasure-loving place, appears in the Archaic period as a kind of southern Etruscan hub. Here, Etruscan language and religious forms mingle with Oscan-speaking locals and Greek settlers along the coast. The Tyrrhenian shore, from Etruria proper down past the Bay of Naples, becomes a patchwork of harbours, sanctuaries and trading enclaves. For a brief moment, if you were standing on a headland above that sea, you might have imagined an Etruscan lake. But they are not alone on the water. Across the straits, on Sicily and the toe of Italy, the Greek world has been planting colonies for generations. Cities like Cumae and Neapolis, founded by Greek settlers, look seaward too, with their own fleets, their own gods who favour sailors and traders. To them, the Tyrrhenian is not an Etruscan lake. It is another arm of the Greek maritime network, another space where goods, stories and influence can flow. Trade, which once drew these worlds together, now becomes one of the points where they grind against each other. Greek and Etruscan merchants want many of the same things: metal from inland Italy, grain from Sicily, pitch and timber from coastal forests, slaves from the edges of their spheres. They also both want to control the bottlenecks, the straits, the best anchorages, the coastal cities that can tax ships or close harbours in time of war. Conflicts begin as pinpricks on this watery map: raids, piracy, interventions in each other's internal politics. A Greek city supports one local faction in a coastal town. An Etruscan city backs their rivals. Ships are seized in harbours under one pretext or another. Sanctuaries that once hosted mixed dedications now see more militarised offerings: armour, helmets, weapons, hung up as thank-you gifts to gods of victory. At some point, these scattered quarrels harden into clearer lines. One of the few events from this period that later writers remember in any detail is a naval clash they call the Battle of Cumae, dated to 524 or 474 BCE, depending on which tradition you follow. The numbers, speeches, and tactical details are all suspect, but underneath the storytelling there is a solid core. Etruscan sea power met a coalition of Greek fleets in the waters off Campania. The Etruscans lost. You can feel the echo of that loss in the archaeology of the following generations. In southern Campania, Etruscan inscriptions become rarer. Greek influence in cities like Cumae and Neapolis grows stronger. Pottery styles shift. Dedications in sanctuaries tilt toward Greek names. It is not that an entire culture vanishes overnight. Local elites still wear Etruscan-style jewellery, still commission tombs with mixed motifs. But the direction of the tide has changed. The south is slipping from the orbit of the northern leagues and into the pull of the Greek and eventually Roman worlds. Further north, in Etruria proper, the impact is more indirect but still real. Etruscan cities had profited immensely from acting as brokers between inland Italy and the Greek markets to the south. Metal from the mines of Populonia or the hills around Volterra could be turned, through trade, into imported luxuries, prestige objects and political capital. If Greek fleets limit Etruscan access to Campanian ports, or if southern clients begin dealing with Greeks directly, those profits shrink. Trade competition at sea translates into budget problems at home. Meanwhile, other pressures are building on land. The northward expansion into the Po Valley, that once looked like a glittering opportunity, also stretches Etruscan resources. Maintaining influence over far-flung northern communities requires garrisons, alliances, and constant attention. And on the horizon beyond those northern plains, new groups appear, Celtic-speaking peoples pushing over the Alps, exploring the river systems that drain south toward Etruscan towns. What we call the decline of Etruscan power is, in this light, less a single collapse than a complicated rearrangement of stresses. To the south, Greek naval coalitions bite into their maritime dominance. To the north, Celtic movements threaten the relatively recent gains in the Po. Inside Etruria, the old pattern of city leagues, loose federations who meet in sanctuaries and vote on common matters, struggles to generate the kind of unified response that a multi-front crisis demands. Some cities adapt by looking inland, away from risky sea routes. They double down on controlling river valleys, on taxing caravans, on acting as middlemen between hill communities and coastal markets that are now as likely to be Greek or, later, Roman as Etruscan. Others, more exposed, more dependent on maritime revenue, begin to fade earlier. Their monumental building programs slow, the richness of their tomb goods declines, their political weight in the councils of the leagues diminishes. The map of influence, once a relatively continuous band from the Po to Campania, starts to look patchier. Against this background of Greek rivalry and internal strain, Rome's story begins to change tempo. In the regal period, Rome is just one more ally, one more pawn, in the games of greater powers. Etruscan cities support one claim to the Roman throne or another. Latin neighbours switch sides depending on who seems stronger that year. But once the Roman monarchy falls, once the Tarquins are expelled in the late 6th century BCE, at least in Roman telling, Rome turns outward with a different kind of energy. It fights its Latin neighbours, not as a client of Etruscan kings, but as a city determined to secure its own hinterland. It makes and breaks treaties with other central Italian peoples. In that process, it keeps bumping up against Etruscan interests. Veii, just across the Tiber to the north, becomes the focal point of this new phase. For generations, Romans and Veientes raid, skirmish, besiege, make truces, and then start again. The wars blend together in the Roman historical tradition into a saga of heroic endurance. Behind the literary flourishes lies a geographic fact. Whoever holds Veii controls some of the best river crossings, farmland, and north-south routes in central Italy. When Veii finally falls, Roman tradition dates it to 396 BCE, after a long siege, something fundamental shifts. This is not a temporary raid or a punitive expedition. Rome takes the city's territory, and crucially begins a pattern it will repeat elsewhere. It settles Roman citizens on the conquered land, plants colonies, redraws the human landscape. An Etruscan city that had once rivaled Rome in power becomes, over time, a Roman outpost. But even here, the pattern is not uniform. Some Etruscan cities, especially those closest to Rome in southern Etruria, feel the pressure earlier. Veii Fidene and others along the Tiber frontier are drawn into Rome's orbit, sometimes violently, sometimes through treaties that limit their independence. Their elites may receive Roman citizenship, or at least Roman legal privileges in exchange for cooperation. Their young men serve in Roman armies. Further north, places like Volsini, Perugia, and Arretium retain more autonomy for longer. They continue to host league meetings, to mint their own coinage, to field their own armies in regional conflicts. When Rome first encounters them formally, it does so as a rising power dealing with established self-confident polities, not as a master granting terms to helpless dependents. The story of Etruscan decline, therefore, is not a single downward line, but a bundle of different curves. Southern centres tied closely to sea trade and caught between Greek fleets and Roman expansion may lose ground early. Interior and northern cities, cushioned by distance and by robust local networks, navigate the changing landscape more successfully, at least for a time. Some pivot toward Roman alliance to hedge against Celtic raids or rival Italian peoples. Others resist, win occasional victories, and then suffer crushing defeats that reshape their fates in a few decisive decades. Naval battles off Campania, skirmishes in the hills near the Tiber, ambushes in Apennine passes, diplomatic missions to distant Greek or Carthaginian courts. Each of these small episodes contributes to the larger arc. By the 4th and 3rd centuries BCE, Rome has learned to exploit this fractured situation. It plays one Etruscan city against another, offers favourable treaties to some, imposes harsher terms on those who resist. It stations garrisons in strategic points, builds roads that tie former Etruscan territories directly back to the Roman heartland, and slowly rewires the networks of trade and patronage that had once flowed through Etruscan leagues. From the inside, if you were an inhabitant of one of these cities, the change might not feel like decline in a single lifetime. You would still walk past old temples, still see augurs watching the sky, still bury your dead with the rites your grandparents used. Greek merchants might be a little more common at the harbour, Roman officials a little more insistent at the tax office, but daily life could continue with long stretches of apparent continuity. It is only when we zoom out, across centuries, across the whole peninsula, that the turning of the tide becomes clear. The Etruscans are being squeezed from several directions at once. By Greek rivals at sea, by Celtic migrants in the north, by shifting trade patterns, by their own internal divisions, and increasingly by the slow, determined advance of Rome. Not in a single clash, not in one neat conquest, but in a series of wars, rivalries, and uneasy truces that redraw the mental map of Italy step by step. Yet even as their political power fractures, their presence remains woven into the fabric of the peninsula that is taking shape. The next part of the story follows that thread, how Rome does not merely defeat Etruscan cities, but absorbs them, people, gods, rituals and all, into its expanding system, until the civilization that once overshadowed Rome is no longer a rival on the map, but something quieter and stranger, half remembered within Rome itself. Rome's system of conquest, when it finally closed over Etruria, did not look like a single hammer blow. It looked like paperwork, oaths, and carefully graded privileges. When an Etruscan city lost a war to Rome in the 4th or 3rd century BCE, the outcome was almost never just, "We surrender, and you are destroyed." What came next was usually a treaty, a written set of terms that fixed everything from who supplied troops to who could marry whom. Romans called some of these agreements federa equa, equal treaties, but equality was always relative. The city might keep its walls, its council, some of its local laws, but it would owe soldiers to Rome's armies, money to Rome's campaigns, and obedience to Rome's foreign policy. It could not make its own alliances. Its freedom shrank inside Roman definitions. Other treaties were explicitly unequal. These were the terms you got if you had resisted too long or picked the wrong side twice in a row. Land could be confiscated and declared ager Romanus, Roman public land. Part of that land might be distributed to Roman citizens to farm. Another part could be used to plant colonies, new communities of Roman or Latin settlers that served both as military outposts and as instruments of cultural change. You can see this pattern already in the aftermath of Veii. After the long siege and capture, Roman tradition remembers a debate. Should the Veientes be sold, killed, displaced? The story ends with a more practical choice. Rome annexes the city's territory, moves in colonists, and even offers some of Veii's land to poorer Roman citizens. In some tellings, Veientine families are allowed to become Roman citizens if they relocate to Rome. Whether every detail of that tradition is accurate or not, the broad shape mirrors what we see elsewhere. In southern Etruria, territories that once formed the rural hinterlands of cities like Veii, Caere, and Tarquinii begin to sprout Roman-style farms, Roman structures, Roman roads. The Latin name of a newly founded colony suddenly sits on what used to be an Etruscan landscape. But even here, conquest is not always a clean replacement. Take Caere, known to the Etruscans as Caesarea, a city that had once been powerful enough to host Greek envoys and intervene in Mediterranean politics. When it comes to terms with Rome in the 4th century, it does not get sacked or erased. Instead, its citizens are given a peculiar status remembered later as civitas sine suffragio, citizenship without the vote. On paper, this meant that Caerites were technically Roman citizens. They could be drafted into the Roman army, they were protected by Roman law, but they could not vote in Roman assemblies or hold Roman magistracies. Their city became, in modern terms, a municipality, attached to Rome but lacking full political rights. For some Etruscan elites, this looked like a cage. For others, it looked like a door. Because Roman citizenship, even the partial version, came with pathways. Over the generations, wealthier families from these cities could send sons to Rome to serve in the army, make legal contracts, buy property, even marry into Roman clans. Success in Roman campaigns could lead to spoils, prestige, and eventually public office. At first those offices might be local, city-level magistracies redefined under Roman oversight. Later, a few particularly ambitious families could use their service and wealth to step into Roman political life proper. By the late Republic you glimpse the long-term result. Roman senators with Etruscan Gentile names, magistrates whose ancestors' tombs lay under Etruscan-style mounds. Cicero mentions Etruscan aristocrats from cities like Arretium and Volsinius participating in Roman politics, serving as clients and patrons within Rome's intricate web of relationships. To reach that point, their families had passed through generations of adjustment, from enemy leaders to allied nobles, from allied nobles to Roman office holders. The cost of survival at the top was integration. Not every city got the Caere treatment. Some, especially those that resisted repeatedly or sided with Rome's enemies in desperate moments, were handled with a sharper edge. Volsini, for example, enters the Roman record as an old and proud Etruscan centre. In the 3rd century BCE, Rome intervenes there supposedly at the request of the city's own aristocrats, who claim that former slaves have seized power and overturned the traditional order. Roman armies come, the conflict ends, and then something drastic happens. The old hilltop Volsini is stripped of its status, and a new community, Volsini Novi, is founded on lower ground under Roman direction. Whether or not the story about rebellious freedmen is accurate, the archaeological reality is clear. A city is physically relocated, its political institutions restructured, its elite lineages survive in some form because they are the ones negotiating the surrender and the move, but they now operate inside a Roman framework. Their old communal independence is gone. At places like Falerii, another town of Etruscan culture but different language roots, Rome repeats this pattern: harsh punishment followed by resettlement, then a gradual smoothing of edges as generations pass and Roman law becomes the norm. Over time, the spectrum of statuses becomes crowded. Some communities are full Roman colonies populated mainly by Roman settlers, bearing Latin names and institutions from the outset. Others are allied cities, socii, that retain formal autonomy and their own elites but are bound tightly to Rome's war machine. Still others occupy intermediate positions, municipia with varying degrees of citizenship, Latin colonies with mixed populations, settlements whose inhabitants slowly acquire Roman rights through service, decree, or favour. In all of these arrangements, Rome's goal is remarkably consistent. It wants soldiers, taxes, and stability. To get those, it is often more effective to co-opt local elites than to annihilate them. An aristocrat from Perugia or Cortona, who can retain his lands, his local prestige, and now the legal power of Roman citizenship, has every incentive to encourage his community to follow Rome's line. His sons can dream, not of restoring a lost league, but of joining the Roman cursus honorum, the ladder of offices that runs upward toward the Senate. This is the quiet machinery of absorption, privilege used as a lure, and beneath it, ordinary life continues with a surprising amount of continuity. In sanctuaries across Etruria, long after formal conquest, people still dedicate offerings in ways that feel deeply Etruscan. Bronze liver models for divination, ritual tools, inscriptions that mix Etruscan formulae with increasingly Latin names. The great necropolis do not vanish overnight. Tomb building continues, though styles simplify and grave goods become less extravagant. Family names persist like buried roots. Roman documents, especially from the late Republic and early Empire, preserve Etruscan gentilitia, family names, that have simply been plugged into Roman naming patterns. A citizen might be called Aulus Cassina, where Cassina reflects an old Etruscan clan. Another might bear a cognomen like Maecenas, that slippery reminder of Etruscan ancestry made famous by the Augustan patron of poets. Artisan traditions, too, flow onward underneath the new political skin. Workshops in cities like Vulci, Tarquini, and Chiusi keep producing fine bronze work, terracotta sculpture, and painted ceramics well into the Roman period. At first their motifs are strongly Etruscan. Over time they shift, adapting to Roman tastes, myths rendered in a more classical style, Latin inscriptions added where Etruscan once would have appeared. But the hands that shape the clay, the methods for firing, the ways of casting bronze, these are techniques passed down through local apprenticeships, not imported wholesale from Rome. If you walked through a market in an Etruscan town in the 3rd century BCE, you might hear overlapping identities in every conversation. People still speak of themselves as men of Tarquini, women of Volaterrae, citizens of Perugia. They attend festivals at ancient hilltop sanctuaries. They honour local gods whose names never fully migrate into Latin. They belong to gentes, extended lineages, that remember old stories of ancestors who built tombs and temples when Rome was young. And yet, above and around that local world, a second identity is taking hold. Legal matters increasingly go through Roman frameworks. Young men travel to distant campaigns under Roman standards. The coinage in circulation bears Roman symbols, Roman magistrates' names, Roman gods. Taxation, census-taking, jurisdiction in serious crimes. All of these are drawn slowly but steadily into Roman hands. There is one realm where erosion is especially stark, language. For a while, Etruscan and Latin coexist. We have inscriptions from the 4th and 3rd centuries where Etruscan is still used for tomb markers, religious dedications and local documents, while Latin appears on coins, official decrees, and anything meant to circulate beyond the city's immediate circle. Bilingual inscriptions hint at a world where educated elites can move between both tongues. But languages live or die on what children hear in the home and need in the street. As Roman law courts, army units, and broader trade networks become essential avenues for advancement, Latin gains an irresistible advantage. A family hoping their sons will succeed as officers, merchants, or municipal officials turns increasingly to Latin instruction. Etruscan can linger for a while as a sacred language of ritual and priestly law, but once it is no longer needed for power, its future narrows to the walls of temples and the memories of specialists. By the 1st century BCE, the written trail thins dramatically. We still find Etruscan words in glossaries, fragments in Roman authors who quote old religious texts or comment on antiquarian curiosities. We see Etruscan names hiding inside Latinized forms, but the living language, spoken, joked in, argued in, sung in, has largely fallen silent. Independent institutions go the same way. City councils that once debated foreign policy now discuss local markets, road repairs, and temple maintenance within the limits of Roman law. League meetings at old sanctuaries lose their diplomatic bite. They might still coordinate festivals, manage shared cults, or arbitrate minor disputes, but they no longer decide war and peace. That authority has migrated south, along the roads Rome built, straight into the hands of magistrates on the Tiber. The result is a strangely double world. On the surface, the map shows an Italy full of Roman colonies, municipal towns, allies bound by treaty. Underneath, in cemeteries, kitchens, workshops and shrines, patterns laid down in the Etruscan centuries continue. People perform divination in ways Rome adopts and rebrands as part of its own Etrusca disciplina. Families cherish ancestor masks and genealogies that stretch back before citizenship. Craftsmen shape roof tiles and bronze mirrors with techniques learned from masters whose masters once signed their work in Etruscan characters. Absorption, in this sense, is not simple disappearance. It is a long, uneven process in which one system, Roman law, Roman citizenship, Roman military organization, wraps itself round another, drawing out its resources and talents, while gradually loosening its separate voice. By the time the Roman world turns east toward Greece, Carthage, and beyond, Etruria is no longer a rival, no longer a politically distinct civilization. It has become a region, a memory, and a set of customs hidden inside Roman religion and Roman names. The civilization that once taught Rome how to build temples and read the sky now lives on mostly as something Rome says it has always had. Erasure doesn't usually look like burning libraries and smashed statues. Most of the time, it looks like someone else telling your story for you. By the late Republic and early Empire, almost everything people knew about the Etruscans came through Roman voices. The old priestly colleges still preserved some secret books, some ritual formulas, but when history was written in Latin, with Roman concerns, the Etruscans became characters in someone else's narrative. Think of Livy, writing in the age of Augustus, looking back over those early centuries. He has Etruscan kings ruling Rome, Etruscan armies marching, Etruscan tyrants being overthrown by brave Republican Romans. But his sources are already filtered. Old annals, family traditions, temple records, all reworked across generations who had grown up with Rome as the default centre of the story. When Livy says, the Etruscans did this, what he often means is, later Romans believed the Etruscans did this. That's a quiet kind of erasure. Events that were once part of an Etruscan city's own history, its founding, its wars, its heroes, get relabeled as prehistory of Rome. The spotlight moves, and whatever is still visible at the edge is described not as its own world, but as the background scenery for Roman beginnings. You can see this in the way Roman authors talk about kings like Tarquinius Priscus and Tarquinius Superbus. In Etruscan terms, these would have been aristocrats from specific cities, with lineages, alliances, rivalries inside the Etruscan league system. In Roman accounts, they shrink into stock figures: the ambitious foreigner, the arrogant tyrant, the cautionary tale that explains why the Republic had to be born. Their Etruscanness becomes a colour, a flavour, an explanation for why they are too much, for sober Roman taste. Over time, Etruscan, in Roman texts, stops being the name of a living civilization and hardens into a set of narrative roles. The skilled diviner, the decadent noble with too much gold and too many banquets, the cruel king with exotic customs, the mysterious expert you consult when the gods seem especially angry. Even praise gets turned into a kind of containment. Roman politicians boast that their family has kept the Etruscan rites of the lightning gods, or that they have access to ancient Etruscan books of prophecy. But those rites and books are now stored in Roman temples, managed by Roman magistrates, interpreted for Roman purposes. The knowledge survives, but its original context is dissolved. Stories do the same work as laws. They fix who is central and who is peripheral. Once Etruscan cities no longer write their own histories in a language anyone reads, Rome can rewrite the past so that Etruria is always a prelude, a warning, or a resource, never a peer. Narrative control is one way a civilization gets erased. Physical space is another. Italy is not kind to ruins that are still on valuable land. When a city declines or is resettled, its old stones do not just sit there quietly. They are quarried for new walls, broken down into road fill, stacked into farmhouses. Temples lose their roofs first, then their columns, then their steps. The clean lines of a podium turn into a rough platform under a later church. In Etruria, this happened again and again. An old hilltop settlement is abandoned for a Roman-planned town on lower ground. The new town needs building material. Those ancient blocks carved under Etruscan magistrates become anonymous foundations under Roman streets. Centuries later, medieval towers and Renaissance palaces rise on top, reusing the same stone. Every reuse is practical. None of it feels like erasure to the people doing it. But each layer makes the earlier story harder to see. Looting adds another quiet cut. In the late Republic and early Empire, Roman aristocrats develop a taste for antique objects. Etruscan bronze mirrors, carved ivory boxes, painted vases. Tombs that lay undisturbed for centuries are opened, stripped, and their contents carried away as conversation pieces for Roman villas. By the time antiquarians in the 18th and 19th centuries start digging seriously, many of the richest tombs have already been plundered in antiquity. What is left is a scattered record, beautiful but incomplete. Some Etruscan sanctuaries fare no better. Altars are toppled or simply neglected. Sacred precincts are cut by new roads, overbuilt by baths, theatres and basilicas. The great Fanum Voltumnae, the central sanctuary of the Etruscan League, has been hunted for decades by archaeologists. It may already lie under fields, farmhouses or a later town. It might even have been dismantled so thoroughly that only faint ghost traces remain in the soil. There is probably more Etruria under modern Italy than above it. Every vineyard, every railway cutting, every suburb has a chance of hiding an Etruscan farmhouse, a tomb, a stretch of road. Some have been found when foundations are dug. Many will never be touched. They are raised simply by being in the wrong place when a new street is planned. And while stone and bronze can sleep in the ground for 2,000 years, language is much more fragile. You saw in the last section how Latin slowly took over the legal and political life of Etruscan cities. Once courts, contracts, military commands and tax records are conducted in one language, the others begin to fold inward. Education finishes what politics begins. Roman-style schooling, where it existed, taught reading and writing in Latin, sometimes Greek. Boys from ambitious families learned to compose Latin speeches, quote Latin poets, interpret Roman law. If Etruscan was taught at all, it was as ritual knowledge, formulas to memorize, not a language to reason in. Priests may have guarded Etruscan religious texts and kept some instruction going into the 1st century BCE, but that kind of knowledge tends to be narrow and conservative. It preserves old words unchanged, even as speech on the street moves on. It is like learning to chant in a dead liturgical language you no longer fully understand. Once children stop playing, arguing and dreaming in Etruscan, the language is effectively gone. The shift also changes how people think of themselves. If your grandfather called himself a man of Volaterrae and spoke Etruscan, but your father calls himself a Roman citizen from Volaterrae and speaks Latin, what are you? By the time we reach the early empire, local identities in Etruria are expressed mostly in Latin terms. A person might still say, I am from Tarquini, might honour local gods whose cults began long before Rome, but their legal name, their official inscriptions, their prayers in public ceremonies, all use the language of the conqueror. Identity quietly tilts. Etruscan becomes not a primary self-description, but an adjective for something specific and limited. In Roman writing you see it attached to specialties. Etruscan haruspices, experts in reading livers and lightning. Etruscan craftsmen famous for bronze work. Etruscan dancers and musicians hired for funerals. Etruscan books of prodigies consulted when comets or earthquakes frighten the city. There is even a sense that Etruscan can mean old-fashioned, arcane, or superstitious. Cicero, who respects Etruscan religious expertise, still frames it as one strand within a Roman whole. Varro, the great Roman scholar, divides theology into categories and slots Etruscan material under the heading useful to the state. Other authors make jokes about Etruscan luxury, Etruscan feasts, Etruscan softness, even while enjoying the imported goods. A word that once named a people and a world is broken into stereotype fragments. Religious seriousness, technical skill, decadent taste, strange old books. When that happens, the civilization is not only politically absorbed and linguistically silenced, it is conceptually flattened. It becomes a set of traits that Romans can pick up and put down as needed. And yet, this is not quite the end of the story. The same empire that helped bury Etruscans under layers of later building also accidentally preserved them. Tombs, sealed for centuries, kept paintings from fading and organic objects from rotting. Abandoned sanctuaries buried by landslides or river silts froze ritual spaces in place. In the 18th and 19th centuries, when European collectors first went hunting for Etruscan vases, they pulled thousands of artifacts out of the ground. At first these pieces were misattributed, mixed up with Greek works, scattered into private collections. But gradually scholars noticed differences, inscriptions in a strange alphabet, iconography that didn't quite match Greek norms, local styles in bronze and terracotta. Bit by bit, Etruria began to reappear. The 20th century added methods the ancients never had. Stratigraphic excavation that records layers carefully, radiocarbon dating, soil analysis, aerial photography revealing buried city grids under modern fields. Today, remote sensing and ground-penetrating radar can map entire necropolies without overturning a single stone. From these tools, a more complex picture emerges. We see not just elite tombs, but farmsteads, workshops, harbour installations. We can trace trade routes from the pattern of imported pottery. We can follow urban planning decisions in how streets and walls shift over centuries. We can even start to glimpse social changes within Etruscan cities long before Rome arrives. Language, too, is pushing against the edge of erasure. The Etruscan language is still not fully understood, but every new inscription is a piece of the puzzle. Bilingual texts, loanwords in Latin, glossaries in late antique writers, all help. Scholars can now read Etruscan aloud, identify grammar patterns, and understand many standard formulae. The great religious books mentioned by Roman authors are still missing, but small ritual texts, legal fragments, and personal dedications turn up in excavations and museum stores. There are still enormous gaps. The Great League Sanctuary of Voltumna is not securely identified. The full extent of many cities remains under modern towns. Vast stretches of countryside hold unexcavated farmsteads and burial grounds. Wooden and cloth objects, which must have been common in daily life, have almost entirely decayed. Much of what the Etruscans knew, felt, and believed will remain beyond reach. But the erasure has not been absolute. Across Italy, in quiet museum rooms, Etruscan faces stare from painted sarcophagi. In university libraries, scholars reconstruct grammar from shards of text. In vineyards and construction sites, chance finds still bring fragments of that lost world back to light. A civilization can be conquered, its language silenced, its stories overwritten, and yet still be there, just below the surface, waiting for someone to listen differently. And in Etruria, the whispers have never fully stopped. If you walk through Rome with Etruria in mind, the city feels a little different. Things that usually read as simply Roman start to look like echoes. Take religion. Those priests reading the sky for signs, the elaborate rituals before a battle, the way a Roman general hesitates if lightning is seen in the wrong quarter of the heavens. That whole habit of thinking the gods speak through patterns and anomalies is deeply Etruscan. The Romans themselves said so. They traced their official science of signs back to the Disciplina Etrusca, the Etruscan discipline. The The idea that there are books, libri haruspicini for entrails, libri fulguralis for lightning, libri rituals for public rites, comes from Etruria. The Romans absorbed it, codified it, and kept using it long after they had forgotten the language in which it was first taught. Every time a senator in the late Republic ordered Etruscan-style experts to interpret a strange comet or an earthquake, a little piece of Etruscan thought was still alive. Even some of the gods carried that memory. Tinia, Uni, Minerva, Etruscan sky god, queen, and wisdom deity, blend into Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva. At first, those are not simple copies. They are local beings with their own cults, their own stories. Over time, as Latin inscriptions take over, the Etruscan names retreat, but structurally the Capitoline triad reigning over Rome's official religion looks very much like an Etruscan model shifted into Latin. Symbols carry the traces too: the curule chair, the bundle of rods called fasces, the lictors who walk before high magistrates. These props of Roman authority seem to grow naturally from the Republic, yet many scholars see Etruscan prototypes behind them, local kings and magistrates who first staged power using those same visual tools. When a Roman consul sat on a curule seat with fasces at his side, he was, knowingly or not, sitting in the shadow of earlier Etruscan rulers, engineering whispers as well. Under modern Rome, old drains and sewers built in heavy, precisely cut blocks recall Etruscan masonry techniques. The great Cloaca Maxima, traditionally linked with Etruscan kings, shows that same taste for massive, durable stonework. The arch, which the Romans later perfected in aqueducts and amphitheatres, appears early in Etruscan gateways and tomb entrances, simple but conceptually bold. Take weight off the lintel, curve the stones, let compression do the work. When Roman builders arch a bridge over a ravine or curve a vault over a bath complex, they are extending a logic already tested in Etruscan cities. Art carries some of the gentlest echoes. On painted tomb walls in places like Tarquinia, banqueters recline on couches, musicians play flutes and lyres, dancers move in long, looping steps. The scenes look festive, almost Greek at first glance, but the style, the particular way eyes are drawn, the colours, the patterns on clothing is their own. Later, in Roman wall painting and sarcophagi, you sometimes feel a faint continuity. The love of banqueting scenes, the combination of joy and solemnity around death, the way families are shown together in a single frame. Roman art is its own thing, heavily influenced by Greece, but inside it there are small motifs and habits that first took shape in Etruscan studios. We can still visit some of these quiet survivors. In Tarquinia and Cerveteri, painted tomb chambers open like little time capsules. You step down into cool underground rooms where Etruscan painters once covered walls with dancers, athletes, processions, and underworld guardians. The names of the dead are in a language we barely read, but the gestures, the feasts, the pets under the couches feel strangely familiar. At Vulci, Veii, Orvieto, and other ancient sites, you find city walls in heavy tufa blocks, gateways with early arches, temple podiums that once carried bright painted terracotta statues. The famous Apollo of Veii, striding forward with archaic smile, is Etruscan, not Greek, though his style talks to both worlds. In museum cases across Italy, bronze mirrors etched with mythic scenes, inscribed dining sets, carved caskets, and painted sarcophagi still carry Etruscan names. A couple reclining together on a lid, smiling in perpetuity, tells you a little about how they wanted to be remembered. For a long time, much of this was seen through Roman tinted glasses. Early scholars read Etruscan art as a provincial offshoot of Greece. Their religion was framed as a kind of exotic superstition useful mainly for understanding Roman prodigy lists. Their engineering was credited to early Rome. Etruria appeared as a curious footnote. New digs, new dating methods, and more careful contextual work changed that. Stratigraphic excavation showed that some supposedly Roman innovations first appear in independent Etruscan layers. Remote sensing revealed large planned Etruscan cities, where earlier generations saw only scattered villages. Isotope analysis of bones hinted at local diets and mobility patterns. Analysis of trade goods traced Etruscan harbours plugged into wider Mediterranean networks. Even small things shift our picture. A newly found inscription, a child's burial with toys, a workshop full of half-finished bronzes, All of these slowly move Etruria from the margins of Roman history back toward the centre of its own story. Language has inched forward too. Where 19th century scholars saw only an undeciphered script, modern work can read many formulae. We can recognise family relationships, ritual phrases, some legal expressions. We know how to pronounce letters, how to divide words. But we still do not have the long narrative texts, the philosophical works, the full ritual manuals that Roman authors hint at. That is the lingering mystery. What would we know if even one shelf of an Etruscan temple library had survived? If we could read their own histories of their cities, their explanations of their gods, their commentaries on signs in the sky and in the liver? If we could hear their voices arguing, joking, telling stories not about Rome, but about themselves? For now, we read them sideways, through Roman reports, through images and architecture, through fragments on stone and bronze. A great deal has been lost, but not everything. There are still songs in the painted dancer's steps, still prayers in the way a tomb is laid out, still knowledge in the curve of an early arch or the pattern of a bronze mirror. If you listen for it, Etruria is not just a vanished prologue. It is a quiet presence in the fabric of Italy, woven into the stones of cities, the rituals of religion, the symbols of power, even the words carved in Latin on later monuments. As you drift towards sleep, you can imagine those hills and coastlines before Rome's name was ever spoken, dotted with cities that had their own sense of time, their own constellations of meaning. Most of their books are gone. Their language speaks to us only in short breaths. But the civilization that Rome tried to fold into its own beginning is still there at the edges, whispering through symbols and stones, inviting anyone who wants to lean a little closer and listen. So tonight you have walked, in your mind at least, through a peninsula that feels familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. You have seen Italy before legions and emperors, when power moved along sea lanes and hilltop roads under names that are mostly gone. You watched Etruscan cities rise out of volcanic stone, learn to talk to the gods through thunder and livers, carve tombs into soft rock and paint their walls with feasts meant to last forever. You saw them trade, argue, make alliances, and eventually get folded into a larger story that wrote their name smaller and smaller as the centuries passed. The outlines are reasonably clear. A people, or perhaps a network of closely related peoples, flourishing along the Tyrrhenian coast, shaping early Rome, then being absorbed as that city-state turned republic and finally empire. Inside those outlines, almost everything is shaded with uncertainty. Origins debated, language only partly read, beliefs glimpsed through the filter of outsiders who often misunderstood what they were seeing. And yet, from those fragments, a civilization still speaks. As you lie there, you can let the details blur. Hill towns become points of light on dark ridges. Harbours full of merchant ships become soft, rocking shapes on a night sea. Priests reading lightning and birds become silhouettes on walls of temple precincts. Roman senators, centuries later, still call for experts from old Etruscan families when the sky does something strange, and somewhere in that continuity you can feel how deep the roots go. Rome rose. Etruria, as a political world, did not survive as long, but traces of Etruscan choices still run through roads, rituals, building techniques and symbols that many people now think of as simply Roman or simply Italian. The fact that we can only recover some of it, and only in glimpses, is part of what gives this past its quiet pull. If this kind of slow journey through older layers of history helps you rest, you can gently help the channel grow. When you have a moment, tomorrow or whenever feels right, tapping like, leaving a comment and subscribing tells the algorithms that there are people who want long, calm stories like this. It helps more sleepy listeners find their way here. And if you feel like sharing, I would really like to know where you're listening from. A city, a country, a tiny village, a ship at sea. Just writing that in the comments slowly builds a little map of all the places these ancient stories are drifting through. If you'd like to go deeper into the much older parts of our species' past, the bottlenecks, the near extinctions, the strange turns that almost ended us before we began, there is a book that grows out of those prehistoric secrets. You can read more about it, and if you want, pick up a copy at sleepytimehistory.com. It expands some of the ideas we only brushed against here, about how fragile and resilient humans can be over enormous stretches of time. For now, though, you don't need to remember names or dates or scholarly debates. You can just hold on to a few images. A stone arch holding up the earth above a tomb, a pair of figures reclining on a carved lid, frozen mid-conversation, a coastline where, long before Rome, ships came and went under Etruscan eyes. Let those fade, if they want to. The hills of ancient Italy sink back into darkness. The painted rooms grow quiet. The rituals have been performed. The feasts are over. The last lamps in the tomb chambers have gone out. Somewhere far above, the same stars wheel over the peninsula, over your own night, linking your present to their long-forgotten evenings. You've walked far enough for one night. From the old harbours of Etruria, from the hills above the Tyrrhenian Sea, from a land before Rome had a name, good night. Sleep well.